Described as the most strategic center of the war, the Crimean Peninsula has been at the center of the clashes for a long time. Crimea is now the primary target of the Ukrainian armed forces for the checkmate move of the chess strategy reconstructed by Kiev. Therefore, critical moves such as explosions, mysterious attacks of unknown origin, and drone attacks on the peninsula begin again. Tensions in Crimea have risen lately. In the last month, 3 airstrikes were carried out on the port of Sevastopol and near the Kerch Bridge. The attacked target was the Russian oil depots and the naval headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. These attacks were perhaps one of the most violent events since the beginning of the war. Simultaneously with the attacks, unidentified drones carried out 2 airstrikes on Moscow, the capital of Russia. In addition, explosions occurred in fuel tanks, ports, and military airports in at least 10 regions in many cities of Russia. These attacks were touted as a flare of Ukraine's upcoming major offensive, in particular, the air attacks of Ukraine and Crimea, and the Russian border cities with swarms of drones alerted the Moscow administration. Crimea has hosted numerous attacks in recent weeks, including multiple drone attacks on the region's largest city, Sevastopol. The Ukrainian army is carrying out attacks in Crimea for 2 purposes. Kiev's aim is to inconvenience the Russian Black Sea Fleet and to interrupt vital Russian supply lines. Accordingly, a large Ukrainian drone army launched an operation at midnight last night against Russian military assets in Crimea. Last night, the Ukrainian armed forces attacked several areas on the Crimean Peninsula, including the Russian Navy in Sevastopol with a swarm of drones. According to Ukrainian military officials, a total of 7 Mugan 5 drones have been deployed to various facilities in different regions of Ukraine. A Russian electronic warfare system deployed near the village of Starygishchi in the north of the peninsula was destroyed. Afterwards, the Ukrainian UAV continued to move towards the airspace south of Slavny, north of Gyankue. The Mama train station was also the target of Ukrainian UAVs. In addition, an airstrike was carried out on the Russian railway line in military depots in Myslova, near the Jiangxi and Kherson highway. Along with these attacks, the Ukrainian armed forces planned to disrupt the logistics between the Kherson region and the Russian army. A Ukrainian drone crashed into a warehouse in the Komsomolskoye settlement near Simferopol. Komsomolskoye is located on the main highway between Simferopol and Gyankue. But the most crucial operation was against the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy. Russian air defense systems deployed in the area again worked after the bombing and unsuccessfully fired at Ukrainian UAVs. 2 drones crashed near Sevastopol, causing a minor explosion. Damage unknown. The effectiveness of adapting the air defense units of the Russian army to regular attacks again fell short, rating with 10 UAVs stored Sevastopol, where Russian S-400 systems are concentrated. The Ukrainian army targeted 2 Russian ammunition depots, a port watchtower, and 2 air defense systems. The massive drone strike on Crimea certainly seems to have caused concern in the Russian military, especially given the regular drone strikes from Ukraine. In particular, the failure of the S-400s to work on time again led to the questioning of the reliability of these air defense systems. So can Ukraine take back Crimea? The continued progress of Ukrainian military efforts seems to surprise many observers more than a year after the war. Still, many observers are likely to highlight Ukraine's failings, challenges, or limitations. Despite the many challenges of attacking the much larger Russian army, some may be inclined to wonder if Ukraine will eventually be able to retake Crimea. If that happens, it will be a tremendous improvement, but apparently not beyond what is possible overall. Ukraine's somewhat unexpected battlefield success has led to some effective counterattacks and the ability to retake certain key areas controlled by the Russian military. However, the Ukrainian military may face some limitations when it comes to fully holding the newly won territories. Besides critical weapons, the Pentagon and other allies are sending tactical trucks and other logistics and transport assets to Ukraine, perhaps to better advance progress or establish forward bases of operation and hold new territory. In addition, Ukraine's partners established a new logistics supply line for the Ukrainian army. However, Ukrainian forces will likely need more heavily armored vehicles to break through the acquired territory. After sending a small number of Bradley combat vehicles and highly effective anti-armor weapons, the Pentagon decided to set up a special production line for Ukraine to build Abrams main battle tanks. Ukrainian fighters have already proven quite capable of destroying Russian tanks from scattered or various attack positions. However, destroying tanks is a little different from reclaiming and holding territory, because this is a mission that probably requires more heavy armor and combined arms maneuvering. For example, a single group of armored vehicles such as Bradley or these Abrams or German Leopards can break through a Russian defensive line, but the Ukrainian army will be forced to maintain control of the area without more mechanized or more heavily armored vehicles. Larger mechanized formations will likely be needed to seize and hold Crimea. So, when will the tanks promised to Ukraine arrive? The Ukrainians will eventually get enough tanks to field a large mechanized force. They will also be able to leave defense and gain sufficient gains with offensive operations to remain successful and operational for a long time. Given their success so far, it seems entirely possible that Ukrainian forces will be able to adequately operate for quite some time. But it may take several years for all of the Abrams to arrive in Ukraine. Despite this, the demoralization of the Russian forces and the lack of combined arms maneuver greatly raised Ukraine's hopes of long-term success. If Ukraine takes all the weapons promised to it and sets up a good strategy, it will be able to take back Crimea. So what is the main problem in reclaiming Crimea? The biggest problem in this regard is still the logistics route of the Russian army between Ukraine and Crimea. Although the Ukrainian army cut the Russian supply lines in other directions of the front line, the line from the Crimea is still standing and continues to be used actively. Western experts suggested that Ukrainian forces could achieve better results in their offensive against Russia if they cut off the Russian supply line along Zaporizhia and Kherson. Experts analyzed Ukraine's advances in counterattacks. Afterwards, they explained that Ukraine could be in an advantageous position if it targets Russia's supply line in the midst of the ongoing war in Bakhmut. As Ukraine continues to launch counterattacks to retake Russian-controlled areas, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced this month that his country will have to wait to launch the main counterattack. Experts had previously said that waiting was a good strategy to help the Ukrainian military take time to plan a counterattack, adding that the attack would begin when the generals felt it was the right time. This is the right moment when all the Russians' remaining supply lines are cut. If the Ukrainian army also cuts the last remaining supply route of the Russians in the south, the ammunition of the Russian army will be exhausted and will not be able to replace it. In particular, the issue of the liberation of Crimea, which is the main target of the Ukrainian army, depends on this. Although the Ukrainian army has warned on Russian targets in Crimea with successful drone and missile attacks, Russia is still not fully effective. Ukraine is putting a lot of effort into the expected counterattack. It makes the best use of satellite images and intelligence from key regions and creates the right strategies compared to the strategists of the Russian army. Ukrainian strategists proved their effectiveness many times during the war. They will show their effectiveness again in the expected counterattack. In this way, Ukraine will be able to get the victory it expects as soon as possible and perhaps put an end to this fierce war. Fires have been raging out of control in Russia lately. A fire that started in Moscow caused a huge panic in the Kremlin palace. The country's leader, Vladimir Putin, had to take urgent measures to prevent the fire from spreading and had to deploy all the fire brigades in Moscow. As the fire continued, fears of loss of life and property grew rapidly. People are worried about the size of the fire and are taking measures to protect their homes. Authorities are requesting additional resources and personnel to fight the fires. But as process may take time, the fire disaster in Russia is seen as part of a series of natural disasters in many parts of the country, and the government may have to take action to review its fire prevention and response strategies. The violent conflict between Russia and Ukraine has been raging relentlessly for months. The regions of Bakhmut and Luhansk have become one of the key flashpoints at the center of the war. Russian forces are making a concerted effort to break through the Ukrainian army's defensive line in Bakhmut while simultaneously continuing their offensive against the Luhansk region. However, Russian troops had difficulty advancing on the ground and could not break through the Bakhmut defense line, and therefore had to increase their airstrikes in recent days as due to modified fighter jets dispatched by the Russian military have moved against Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. However, Ukrainian troops tightened their defenses, prevented Russian warplanes from entering Bakhmut airspace and neutralized them. Ukrainian soldiers successfully shot down Su-25 fighter jets piloted by Russian pilots using portable anti-aircraft missile systems after the missiles hit the fighter jets. The flaming aircraft hovered in the air for some time and eventually crashed near the city limits of Bakhmut. The events in the Luhansk region marked an important turning point in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Russian forces acted with great determination to halt the Ukrainian army's advance in Luhansk on the instructions of the Russian Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov. A large number of Russian troops were deployed to the Luhansk region. The Ukrainian army set out from Lyman with a battalion which quickly moved towards the Lysychansk region. Russian forces resistance for a long time. But in the final battles, the Ukrainian army succeeded in retaking Luhansk. The retreating Russian troops tried to regroup in the Luhansk region. However, Russian General Gerasimov, concerned about the threat of the Ukrainian army retaking Luhansk, decided to transfer some Russian troops from Ukrainian territory to this region. Although the Lysychansk region had been under Russian control for a long time, it was liberated from the occupiers by the Ukrainian army and returned under Ukrainian rule. With this success, the Ukrainian army began to recapture areas where Russian forces were beginning to weaken. While these developments were taking place on the territory of Ukraine, where the war was continuing, an explosion occurred in Moscow, the capital of Russia. The explosion put the Kremlin palace on red alert, prompting an emergency meeting of Kremlin officials under the leadership of Vladimir Putin. Kremlin officials met to assess the situation and take appropriate action. It is a fact that recently there has been an increase of explosions and fires on the territory of Russia. These incidents have started to cause great discomfort among Russian citizens. A natural gas production facility belonging to Gazprom company in Moscow caused a great panic with an explosion. If the explosion had gone a few meters further, it could have reached the facilities, natural gas reservoirs, and caused a catastrophic explosion. The incident took place late at night at one of Russia's largest natural gas production facilities. The explosion is alleged to have been caused by sabotage. Recently, Ukrainian insurgents operating in Russia have caused explosions in a series of sabotage attacks. It is believed that these sabotages were carried out using plastic explosives. The flames rising after the explosion reached the height of several meters. Immediately after the incident, Russian government officials mobilized all fire brigades in Moscow to bring the fire under control. Citizens living in the immediate vicinity of the explosion recorded footage of the fire and shared it on social media platforms, sparking a great deal of interest on social media. Gazprom executives claimed that the explosion was the result of sabotage organized by Ukraine. But earlier in the morning, Russian government officials made an official statement to that effect, saying that the incident was an accident. The Russian government does not want to admit that the explosions and fires on Russian territory were carried out by Ukrainian insurgents. For this reason, Gazprom's director changed his previous statement, saying that they had made an incorrect assessment and that the explosion was caused by a leak in the natural gas pipeline. The recent spate of fires and explosions in Russia has seriously shaken confidence in Putin. In particular, the major damage to a Russian Navy ship in an explosion in the port of St. Petersburg has increased these concerns. Although Russian authorities claim that the incident was an accident, experts believe that the explosion was the result of sabotage. Recent attacks by pro-Ukrainian resistance groups operating in Russia have contributed to the increase in explosions and fires, especially the presence of minority groups of Ukrainian origin living in Russia's autonomous republics plays a role in these attacks. Resistance organizations established in regions such as Crimea and Dagestan aim to make Russia lose power in the areas under its control. In recent weeks, a secret Ukrainian resistance organization called FIRE has emerged and shared images of the operation on social media, claiming that it neutralized Russian commanders in Crimea. This organization aims to liberate Crimea from Russian control and reunite it with Ukraine. These explosions and fires show that the Russian government is having difficulties in dealing with the Ukrainian insurgents and that Putin failed to anticipate that the war would spread to Russia when he invaded Ukraine. These events have shaken the Russian public's confidence in Putin's rule, and the government is expected to take more effective measures to solve the problem. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has had to deal with growing protests and demonstrations within Russia's borders at the same time as he continues his occupation of Ukraine. At the beginning, Putin deceived the Russian people by claiming that the war would end in a short time and that Russian soldiers were unharmed. However, since the first months of the war, the Russian army has suffered serious losses in Ukraine, with more than 190,000 soldiers killed. This situation has become one of the most angered and disturbed issues for the Russian people. Despite the heavy losses, the Russian army continues its occupation of Ukraine and even sends young Russian men of conscription age to Ukraine in order to recruit more soldiers with the partial mobilization decision announced by Putin. However, the patience of the Russian people has run out. Fed up with Putin's repressive and aggressive policies towards Ukraine and the Russian people, citizens have taken to the streets to organize anti-Putin demonstrations. These protests started especially in big cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, and soon spread to various spots of the country. Putin is seriously worried that the protests will grow and pose a threat to him. Therefore, he has been trying to prevent the protests by giving white powers to the Russian security forces. However, these interactions and repressions have not deterred the protesters. On the contrary, they have motivated them even more. The number of Russian citizens detained for anti-war protests has exceeded 20,000. Putin threatened to imprison those who participated in the protests and tried to intimidate the public in this way. He also announced that the television channels criticizing the occupation in Ukraine or denigrating the Russian government would be fined and reporters would be prosecuted. With these steps, Putin aims to suppress dissent and silence the voice of the people. However, this has led to a reduction in protests in Russia, but not a complete end to them. Putin is motivated by the fear of securing his authority and losing his throne. He continues his aggressive policies in order to appease the public outcry and create an obedient society. However, anti-Putin movements are growing stronger and spreading among the population as Russia's future remains uncertain. Putin's power struggle and his domestic policies are being closely monitored, both nationally and internationally. A critical move came from Ukraine. The Russian army was completely cornered with this development, with the Ukrainian army taking a very serious position against Russia. The Kremlin issued a red alert. With this, the Russian army was forced to withdraw from certain areas, and Putin is furious. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army took very different steps. Having cornered the Russian army, Ukrainian soldiers now have an advantage in many areas. But thanks to this latest operation, it has once again become clear that the Russian army is facing very serious problems. But the top-secret information in the headquarters of the Russian army has been revealed. Thanks to this, the Ukrainian army has turned things completely in its favor, thanks to the information received by the Ukrainian army from the agents sent into the Russian army. It was only a matter of time before things changed. The one-month itinerary of the authorized names of the Russian army was revealed. This paved the way for the Ukrainian army to squeeze the authorized Russians because every one of the important names was exposed by the Ukrainian army. Cornered by these steps, the Russian army did not know what kind of moves to take, but the Russian military was not fully aware of how much intelligence the Ukrainians had. So Putin simply put his army on the defensive in certain areas when it became known to the Ukrainian army that the headquarters commanders were meeting in Donetsk. Preparations began for the biggest operation ever. The Ukrainian army decided to use a special unit for this operation. The Cracking Group, which has so far achieved many victories against the Russian army, was chosen. The Russian army had previously suffered heavy defeats against this group. Knowing this, the Cracking Group mobilized with its most skilled team. The news came that the commanders of the headquarters in Donetsk would be meeting very soon, and the snipers of the Cracking Group mobilized. At the same time, the headquarters in Donetsk was positioned to be surrounded by Ukrainian troops. In return, the Ukrainian army brought all the missile systems close by, which could be used against the Russian army if the operation got into trouble. This step showed that Ukraine was willing to go to any lengths to achieve success, and the Ukrainian army showed the whole world that it is now mobilized for a decisive strike. The importance of the meeting of the Russian headquarters commanders for the region was known to everyone. The Ukrainian army launched the operation. First of all, the room where the Russian commanders were located was detected by snipers, while 5 snipers were targeting the headquarters commanders. One of the Russian soldiers detected the sniper. The commanders were taken to a safe area in the headquarters, where a red alert was immediately issued. But the Ukrainian army was prepared to take very different steps for this operation, unaware that they were surrounded. Russian soldiers immediately attacked, but the Ukrainian army surrounded the Russians from all sides in mutual clashes. The Ukrainian army was determined to deal a very heavy blow to the Russians as a result of these attacks with heavy weapons. The Ukrainian army was going to turn the tide in its favor thanks to the rocket launchers it used in its positions. The last rocket launched at the southern wall destroyed the wall. And with that, the tide turned completely in favor of Ukraine. The Russians decided to evacuate the headquarters immediately. The Russians went to the back of the headquarters to prepare the vehicles for this and were enough for a big surprise. The Ukrainian army had blown up all the vehicles. With this, the Russian army started to have problems with evacuation. After this operation against the Russians, the Ukrainian army took a different step and tried to hold the routes. But things did not go as the Ukrainian army wanted, and the Russian army made a very big move. When the Russians count a small vulnerability of Ukraine, they contacted the center from the area outside the jammers. This contact was indicative of a critical mistake by the Ukrainian army that could be the salvation of the Russian commanders. The Russian army immediately requested reinforcements and mobilized drones to push the Ukrainian army back. This forced the Ukrainian soldiers who were unable to enter the headquarters to retreat with the Ukrainian army. Reports the Russian headquarters commanders were immediately rescued, but the Ukrainian army had a very different plan. This plan would deal a very heavy blow to Putin. After the Russian commanders fled, the Ukrainian army realized that the resistance of the Russian soldiers had also been broken. The Ukrainian soldiers went on the offensive with all their might, and their main objective from the beginning of the mission was to capture the Russian headquarters. With this step, the Ukrainian army completely cornered the Russians in the region, advancing with explosives, targeting the headquarters and ammunition depots of the Russian army. The Ukrainian army took the step that would cause the greatest damage to the headquarters. This headquarters and ammunition depots of the Russians, such as the communication power plant, were completely blown up. The Ukrainian soldiers who left the area were welcomed as heroes for changing the course of the war in a short time. This showed to the whole world that the Ukrainian army had achieved a great victory in a very short period of time. But with these latest developments, the Kremlin has entered its worst period ever, and the Russian army is now cornered in Donetsk. As in many other regions, the Ukrainian army's recent breakthroughs are all about strategic gains. Thanks to these big steps, the Ukrainian army is preparing to end the war, and this process is expected to have very different indicators for the Ukrainian army. The Russian army, on the other hand, is in a very bad situation. However, Putin's unwillingness to take the slightest responsibility is the basis for things to get worse. The comments of our analysts about the situation will stun the whole world. According to war analysts, the steps taken by the Ukrainian army are now critical. It has shown the world the footsteps of victory over the Russian army. Thanks to this attitude, the Ukrainian army is now in a position to win victory in many areas, especially now that the latest strategic moves have come into their own. It has become clear that each and every one of the supports is of crucial importance. If this continues, it is expected that the Ukrainian army will soon be victorious over. The Ukrainian army is now expected to take a very big step and come to a point where it can deal the final blow to the Russian army. The nature of the support for the Ukrainian army has recently become quite different. One of the main reasons for this difference is the countries think that the Ukrainian army should end the war. These countries will have Ukraine calculate how long it will take to completely expel the Russians from its territory. And these latest developments will form the basis for the Ukrainian army to completely corner the Russians. There are many developments in this area because of Ukraine's capabilities. Ukraine is now being enabled to take many steps to attack. Many steps are expected to be taken in regions like Donetsk to ensure that the Russians are completely repelled. And thanks to this, it is known that Putin is making these decisions, risking not only the course of the war, but also his own throne. Recent developments suggest that Ukraine will win the war in many areas. But if Putin's throne is in trouble, many countries have ideas about how to move against Russia. And these ideas are expected to manifest themselves in the short term. In this case, a situation like Putin's resignation is a point where the war will be completely lost. The fact that the Russian army is uncomfortable with Putin and wants to withdraw from Ukraine actually ensures the continuation of political instability in many areas. While it is not known exactly what steps will be taken against Russia, Ukraine is now very likely to win the war, and this is made possible by the adequacy of the steps taken in the last days. Even Putin, who said that the fight against the Ukrainian army was vital, especially in the last period of the war, is thought to have accepted the loss.